Welcome, friends. Glowing Star, are you ready to listen to thrilling stories filled with adventure and suspense? Here, we share experiences that might send shivers down your spines and tales that make you think twice before making any decisions. If you like any of the stories you encounter here, don't hesitate to leave a comment and let us know what's on your mind. And if you have your own story to share with us, this is the perfect place to do so. Speech Balloon. We hope you enjoy everything we offer, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated with all the latest content. Bell backhand index pointing down. It was a summer night when I decided to go kayaking on Lake Superior. The weather had been decent all day, and I figured I could handle an evening paddle before heading back to camp, where I had my RV set up. I'd been kayaking for years, so I wasn't worried. I knew the lake could get rough, but that night it seemed calm. The sun set behind the trees, and I could see the shore, so I kept paddling. However, I lost track of time. 1 minute, the sky was fading from orange to purple, and the next, the world was dark. I didn't realize how far out I had gone from shore until it was too late. The lights from the distant campsite where I had launched my kayak were gone. The only thing I could see was water and the dim outline of the shore, barely visible in the moonlight. The shore didn't look the same in the dark. I paddled up and down the shore, looking for my campsite, but I couldn't find it anywhere I looked. I didn't know if the light that indicated where my campsite was had gone out or been turned off, or if I was just that far off. I kept paddling, but I didn't want to go too far in one direction in case it was the complete opposite way. So, I'm not sure how much land I actually covered. I didn't know how long I had been out there, maybe an hour, maybe more. But the more time passed, the more my mind played tricks on me. Every wave felt bigger than the last, and every gust of wind felt like it was pushing me farther out, away from the shore. I had to work hard to stay near the shore, and I was scared. I thought about the weather turning and getting caught in a storm or something like that. I was shaking, even though it wasn't that cold yet. The fear was making it worse. After what felt like forever, I finally saw something, a light. It was a small dot in the distance, and the first light I had seen the whole time since I had been out on the water. I paddled towards it as hard as I could and was so relieved to be out of the water. The light ended up being the house of an elderly couple who let me stay the night. I'm so grateful to them and glad that they took me in without a problem. I had ended up a whole 12 miles from where my campsite was. I have no idea how that happened. I thought I'd been staying pretty close to the same spot, but I guess I had really gone the complete opposite direction in the 3+ hours I was out there. Ironically enough, the next morning, the easiest way to get back to my campsite with my kayak was just to paddle back during the light of day, and with the help of directions from the elderly couple, I was able to make it back to my campsite with no problems. I don't know what I would have done if I never found a house and a place to stay for the night. The only options were to just keep paddling my kayak or sit out there until morning. I guess that night was the most exhausted I've ever been in my life because of all the paddling I did. I still kayak in many locations on Lake Superior, but I'm more careful now, and I don't usually go out at night anymore. When I was a teenager, I got a good scare and learned a good life lesson. I was 14, and my friend Tyler and I had snuck out of our cabin after hours. We didn't plan to go far, just a short walk around the campgrounds. We wanted to explore a little, talk about whatever was on our minds, and maybe see if we could scare each other. We were bored. We had spent the whole week at camp doing all the usual stuff like hiking, swimming, and evening campfires. But that night, we felt like doing something different. We didn't realize how dumb it was until it was too late. We left our cabin quietly, trying not to wake anyone, and walked down the path toward the woods behind the camp. The camp was isolated, with no houses for miles, no streetlights, just trees and a couple of small buildings scattered around. We knew the camp pretty well, but we had never tried to navigate it in the pitch dark. We wandered for what felt like a while, just talking and laughing in the dark. We figured we'd make it back before anyone noticed we were gone. But when we turned around to head back, we realized the camp didn't look the same. The trail we had followed into the woods didn't seem familiar. The lights from the cabins were not where they should have been, and the shadows from the trees were deeper, like they were closing in. Tyler and I started walking faster, but it only made things worse. The more we tried to get back, the farther we seemed to get. The trail was different. It twisted and turned in ways we didn't remember. The trees looked bigger, and the path narrower. It was like the woods were alive, shifting around us. We tried to retrace our steps, but it felt hopeless. By then, we were both nervous. Tyler kept insisting we'd get back, that we just needed to keep walking, but I wasn't so sure. My mind kept jumping to all the creepy stories we heard at campfires earlier in the week. You know, the usual scary stories about lost campers, strange sounds in the woods, and old legends. Nobody really believes them, but they still make you uneasy. After about an hour, we stopped. The woods were thick, and the moonlight barely cut through the branches. There was an eerie silence, like everything was holding its breath. That's when we heard something, a noise far off in the distance. It sounded like footsteps with the crunching of leaves and twigs breaking. Someone was walking, but not in a normal way. It was like they were dragging their feet. We didn't say anything, but we both knew we had to get out of there. We started walking again, only this time it was with a sense of urgency. It felt like we had to get back before whatever was back there caught up with us. Finally, we saw one of the camp cabin's lights, faint but visible through the trees. We moved toward it quickly, trying not to trip over roots or rocks in the dark. We finally broke through the trees and went back onto the main path, right in front of the main campfire area. By the time we got back to our cabin, we didn't say a word to anyone. Nobody knew we had been gone. I'm not sure what happened out there in the woods that night, but I know we both felt something wasn't right. It sounds fake, but it was the weirdest sensation ever. It felt like the woods were changing constantly, somehow trying to keep us trapped out there. The weirdest part of the whole night was that I had my watch with me, and according to my watch, we had been out there for at least an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours. I wasn't sure of the exact time we had left, but I knew it was for sure over an hour. However, when we got back to our cabin and saw the clocks there, only half an hour had passed. After that, we never went exploring in the dark again at church camp. Back in the 90s, when I was in high school, I was very good with my hands and worked jobs like construction, demolition, flooring, and auto mechanics. One of the jobs I did was working for a guy doing remodeling projects, restaurants, bars, retail shops, and typical commercial projects. I went to school during the day, of course, and would sometimes work after school or on weekends for the guy I worked for. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave me alone at a site with a list of things for me to do, mostly demolition work. He picked me up one Saturday morning because I didn't have a car or license yet, so he would pick me up and drive me to sites for work, then leave me alone there. I rarely worked with his other crews since they were the more skilled laborers, so I would tear up the place before the main crew came in to do all the remodeling. Here's the part that was my major downfall to this story. I didn't pay attention to where we were going. I was too busy talking to him, and I think we were talking about cars or something. It took a long time to get to the site, and as we drove up, it was in the middle of nowhere in the Mojave Desert. I knew we left the highway and went down a few other two-lane highways for a long distance, but I had no idea where we were. I had a big jug of water with me because the water to the house I would be working at was off. When we pulled up to the house, I pulled all my tools out of the truck before he left, and he then drove to another site that he would be working on. He told me that he would be back to pick me up at about 5 o'clock or 6 p.m., since it should only take me until then to do what I needed to do. That was always his way of saying, "I'm only paying you till this time, so you better get everything done by then." It was never unfair, and we always had a good understanding of time and tasks. He drove away, and I was at this property all alone. I walked into the house, and it was mostly empty. My job was to remove all the remaining furniture, contents, appliances, flooring, gut the kitchen and bathroom, and remove all the wood paneling. I was used to being on sites alone and working all night, and this was in the daytime on a Saturday. But the house kind of gave me the spooks. The house was old, dark, musty, and kind of cool inside. The kind of cool that gives you goosebumps. I started removing all the junk from the house as I normally did on a project. I tore up all the flooring next, and to my delight, everything seemed to come up with ease. It was rip, cut, and toss. I took a big demo hammer to the kitchen and tore it apart in less than an hour. I ended up using the big jug of water that my boss had given me to wash my hands and face periodically. So by late afternoon, I was down to my last drink and had already eaten everything I brought. No worries though, because I would be getting picked up in a couple of hours. I finished all my tasks and even swept the entire place so the next crew could get right to work later that week. At that time of year, when I was out there, it wasn't a typical hot desert day, but you know, in the desert, as soon as the sun goes down, it starts to cool rapidly. I had a flannel shirt, but that wasn't enough, and it was starting to get dark. My ride was running late, so all I could do was wait. This was the time before cell phones were common, and there was no electricity, water, or phone service in the house. I climbed up to get to the top of the roof of the house to get a better look to see if I could see something in the distance. Miles down a smaller road, I saw a few homes, but those homes were all dark. My first thought was to hike down to a neighbor's house and ask them to use a phone. I didn't want to leave though, in fear of missing my ride, especially since it didn't look like anyone was home since no lights were on in any houses. I started to think about my options as darkness approached fast. My options were either to stay at the house until morning, hike what little water I had a few miles in the desert at night, or wait until early morning and hike out there to some sort of civilization. I decided my best option was to just stay and hope that my ride would show up. It also suddenly occurred to me that no one knew where I was except my boss. I don't know if he told anyone else where I was. Either way, my family wouldn't miss me until maybe Sunday night because they knew me and how much I would work, and they never worried about me not coming home. As full darkness was all around me, I didn't have a flashlight or any way to make a fire, but luckily, the moonlight was bright. It was getting cold outside, so I went back inside the empty, creepy house that somehow seemed even more creepy when mostly empty. At about 8 p.m., the batteries on my radio, which was my only source of a little light and noise, started to die. I grabbed an old wooden chair and just sat in the living room of this house, doing absolutely nothing except waiting. I started to hear the wind and odd noises, which I assumed were animals in the distance. I started to shiver from the cold, and my mind might have started to play tricks on me. I saw shadows moving outside and inside the house. I also started to hear someone talking, like whispers or something. I was sure I was going crazy and got up from my chair and yelled out, "Hello?" Just as I did, I heard something fall on the other side of the house. I had enough of this creepy house, so I went outside again. At least in the moonlight, I could see better. Off in the distance, I heard noises and saw movement but couldn't make out anything. I had a pile of tools by the edge of the house ready for when my boss picked me up, so I ran over there and grabbed a heavy pry bar. I was ready to defend myself for whoever was out there. I had to keep moving because my undershirt and flannel shirt were not enough to keep me warm. The wind was also starting to pick up, and as far as I could see, there were no lights around me. I didn't want to try to make it up on the house again out of fear of falling in the dark, but I got up on top of the gate just to try to gain a little bit of height to see if I could see some house lights nearby or car lights. My mind went to the stories that circulated at the time about people who would come up to the Mojave Desert and bury bodies, how there were evil groups out here, and how people would go missing for no reason. Every noise had me on edge, and every shadow had my heart pounding. I knew no one was in the house, but I was sure I could hear noises from inside. I huddled up on the front porch for warmth, looking in the living room window, expecting to see someone at any moment. By around 11 p.m., I looked at my watch, thinking this was going to be a long night, as all this stuff only happened since it got dark. I didn't know how I was going to make it for another 6 hours until daybreak. Closer to midnight, I was wide awake. My eyes were only fixed on the dirt road, thinking that any time now, a car would come down, and maybe they could help me. I remember casually turning around to look back to the house because all this time I kept hearing noises, but I told myself it was a rat or some animal. I saw a shadow of a person moving from the kitchen to down the hall. I jumped up from sitting and started backing my way out of the porch, away from the house. As I was backing up, I tripped over the debris pile and fell down on the ground. I tried to get up but fell again. It was like something pushed me down. Or maybe it was my imagination. But all of a sudden, these bright lights were coming closer to me as I was laying on the ground. I saw my boss standing above me with a flashlight, wondering what I was doing on the ground. I was just so glad to see him. I wasn't mad, I just asked him what happened. He said that he was sorry but thought the other crew was coming to get me, and they thought he was coming, so no one actually came. He said it wasn't until later in the evening that he asked the other crew leader about how far along the house I had gotten, and that's when they realized I was still out there. My boss felt really bad and told me he was going to pay me for the entire time I was out there. As he was driving me home, I asked about the house and told him how creepy it was. He said he didn't have any information on the house and only just knew what we were supposed to do. I don't know if I was going delusional or something, but that time I spent out there by myself, lost in the middle of the desert at night, was the scariest night of my life. What was so weird is I never saw any headlights of a car approaching. My only memory of being rescued was seeing my boss standing over me with his flashlight. I'm not exactly sure what happened that night, but it was so creepy. After that, I made sure to always keep extra batteries, a flashlight, and double the amount of liquid with me. I've been hiking for a few years now, and one evening I went hiking on a trail I've done before, which I considered my favorite. It's well known for its beautiful views, and I had planned on a simple evening hike. I wasn't expecting it to take too long, so I didn't bring much, just water, a few snacks, and my phone. As the evening went on, the weather turned cooler, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, and I knew it would be getting dark soon. I had planned to stick to the main path, but I decided to take a shortcut that would get me back to the car a little faster. I'd done it before without issue, but this time, the shortcut led me into unfamiliar terrain. The woods were denser here, daylight was fading quickly, and I had to have made a wrong turn or missed a turn at some point. At first, I didn't panic because I thought I could still find my way, but as I kept walking, I realized I didn't recognize anything. The path was barely a trail now, just some faint markings in the dirt that I could barely follow. My phone had no signal, and when I tried calling for help, it just showed that dreaded, "no service" message. It was already getting darker, and I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Right as it was getting dark, I saw an old shack up ahead of me. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been used in years, but it also didn't look like it had fallen apart. The door was slightly open, and nobody was inside, so I decided to go in. It seemed like a strange thing to find out here, but at that point, I didn't have many options. I figured I could use it for shelter for the night until morning when I could see the woods better. The shack was small, with old wooden walls. There was some broken furniture, a dusty table, and a few old crates scattered around on the carpet that covered the ground. It wasn't much, but it was better than sitting outside in the dark. I locked the door behind me and settled into the corner with my bag as a pillow, lying on top of the carpet so that I had at least a little padding. Around midnight, I began hearing noises. It was faint, but there were noises now and then coming from below the shack. At first, I thought an animal had made its home under the shack, but as the night went on, I heard a lot of different noises, some louder scrapes or just overall rustling around. I was confused but tried to ignore the faint noises as I drifted in and out of sleep throughout the night. It all came together for me when suddenly I heard loud steps ascending towards me in the middle of the night. There was a lower level below me, like a bunker in the ground. As the steps worked their way towards me, I felt a slight push below. I realized I was laying right over the entrance to down below, which must have been a trapdoor below the carpet that I was laying on. I shouted out, "Hello?" kind of out of instinct, and didn't know what else to do. Whoever was below me, trying to open the door, frantically ran back down the stairs. A few moments later, I heard someone scrambling away into the woods, making a lot of noise as they went. I was a little worried that the person might come back, but I wasn't going to find the trail in the middle of the night, so I stayed. I spent the rest of the night huddled up in the shack, hoping that the morning would come soon. In the morning, before I left the shack, I tried to open the trap door below the carpet, but it was locked, and I couldn't find any other entrance to the bunker below me. There had to be another entrance because whoever was down there had taken off into the woods earlier that night from a different exit, but it was well hidden because I didn't see it. I made my way back to the hiking trail easily. It was easier to figure out where I was going in the daylight, and after a few hours, I was back at the parking lot. I immediately reported what I found to the authorities, but when they asked for the details on the location, I couldn't give them an exact spot. The area was so far off the main trail, and I didn't really know where it was. I don't know if the authorities ever even looked for the shack and bunker or if they ever found it. Maybe they didn't take me seriously or figured it was nothing to worry about. To this day, though, I question myself why someone needed a hidden bunker below an old wooden shack in the middle of the woods. It must have been some sort of extreme doomsday prep type of person or someone who is up to no good. One of my last years at church camp. When I was a teenager, I was staying over at a friend's house in an Eastern European neighborhood. One night, my friend who lived in the house, whom I will call Ava, had already passed out from exhaustion, while another friend, whom I will call Abigail, and I were still up talking. We were getting bored and not tired at all, so we decided to sneak out. Honestly, looking back, I have no idea what we were thinking. Our plan was simple. We would walk straight, follow the road, and get to the town's river. We started out, and no one else was awake. The neighborhood was dead quiet. We didn't have much of a plan after the river. I just figured we'd hang out there for a bit, talk about boys, and maybe even smoke a cigarette. That's exactly what we did. When we reached the park near the river, we found a secluded spot, leaned against the swing set, and lit up a cigarette to share. We barely noticed the time passing and must have been there for a little while. At some point, I noticed near the entrance of the park that a middle-aged man was standing there, just staring at us. We had our eye on him since he was also smoking a cigarette, but as he started walking towards us, my stomach dropped. I whispered to Abigail that this was probably not a good thing, and I nudged her to stand up so we could leave immediately. We started walking quickly but not obviously running. We tried to pretend like we weren't panicking and that we were just leaving normally. I kept glancing over my shoulder to see if the man was still following us, but he wasn't. Instead, he just turned around and got into a wide van that had been parked nearby. That made me nervous too because it looked like he was waiting for us to leave. I noticed the van had pulled out and was following us from a distance. It wasn't close, but it was enough for me to feel uncomfortable. We'd been walking for what felt like forever, but I thought that we were close enough to Ava's house by now. Abigail, who had been leading the way, suddenly whispered to me that we were lost. Neither of us lived in nor knew the neighborhood too well, and we had no idea where Ava's house was now. We had no idea where we were. I thought that we had been heading in the right direction, but everything looked unfamiliar now. Every corner we turned seemed to lead to more confusion. We kept walking, turning down random roads, hoping to find something familiar, but the more we searched, the worse it got. I kept thinking about the van, which was still following us at a distance. We knew we had made a huge mistake, and as we walked, we tried to figure out our next plan of action. Finally, to our surprise, we saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Ava's dad. He was standing at the end of the street, looking angry but relieved at the same time. He had a flashlight with him and had been clearly searching for us. He didn't give us much of a chance to explain before he practically dragged us back into the house. We were both shaken up and too scared to argue. We got the lecture of a lifetime from Ava's dad, but honestly, I was just glad that we were safe. Looking back now, I can't help but feel like we had a guardian angel watching over us that night. Luckily, Ava had woken up in the middle of the night to see that we were gone and decided to tell her dad. I guess she was very worried because she knew we had been gone a while since our beds were cold. It could have ended so differently. The man from the park who was following us in the van never got any closer. He might have been waiting for us to stop or something. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if we hadn't been rescued and just kept walking around with that van following us. That night, we learned the hard way not to play around with things like that. I still think about it sometimes and wonder how close we really were to something much worse.